Christmas Eve, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The wind rolled softly across the barren fields, carrying the faint scent of pine and dust. Floodlights cut through the darkness, sketching long shadows against the barbed wire. Inside the camp, a dozen German prisoners huddled near the wooden barracks, their breath rising in pale clouds. Some sang under their breath, fragments of Stille Nacht drifting through the cold Texan air. On the other side of the wire, an American guard stood watch, a young man from a cattle ranch outside Waco, wearing a khaki coat and a weathered Stetson tilted low against the chill. He listened quietly, his rifle slung loosely across his shoulder, the music softening something inside him. When the song ended, silence followed. Then, almost shyly, the guard stepped closer to the fence. From his hand, he held out the hat, his own cowboy hat, through the wire. For a long moment, the German prisoner just stared, unsure if it was real. Then, trembling, he reached for it. No words were exchanged, just a nod and eyes glistening in the dim light. Two men, once enemies, standing on opposite sides of a war, sharing the only gift that mattered, human dignity. And in that quiet exchange, something shifted, the meaning of victory itself. America, 1943. The war had turned, and the prisoners began to arrive. By mid-1943, the Atlantic convoys no longer carried only fuel, food, and munitions from Europe. They carried men, thousands of captured German soldiers from the deserts of North Africa and the fields of Sicily. The United States, suddenly responsible for housing the enemy, began constructing a vast network of prisoner-of-war camps across the country. They appeared quietly in the heartland, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Kansas. Camps were built near rail lines and army depots, far from coasts and cities. Among them stood Camp Hearn, a sprawling complex north of Houston that would soon hold more than 4,000 German prisoners, men of the Afrika Korps, Luftwaffe, and Wehrmacht. The decision to treat these men humanely was not sentimental. It was strategic. The Geneva Convention of 1929 demanded fair treatment of prisoners, and Washington understood that honoring it could ensure American captives in Europe were spared retaliation. But beyond law, there was also something deeply cultural in how these camps evolved. American guards, many from small farming towns or ranching families, carried with them a code older than the war: decency, work, and respect. Inside the wire, life for the German prisoners was disciplined yet unexpectedly humane. They worked in cotton fields, timber yards, and canning factories, earning small wages. They played soccer and built orchestras. Some even performed theater plays for Red Cross visitors. It was captivity, but not cruelty. For men who had marched under Hitler's banners, many expecting vengeance from their enemies, the shock was profound. They found not humiliation but order, not starvation but rations nearly equal to those of American soldiers. They received mail, medical care, and church services. For some, it was their first experience of true personal freedom, inside a prison camp. Still, beneath the routines, tension lingered. Among the prisoners were hardened Nazis who enforced ideological loyalty with threats and violence. Camp officials often divided prisoners to prevent clashes, separating political hardliners from the disillusioned and weary. And slowly, as months turned into years, the myths of Nazi propaganda began to crumble under the weight of ordinary kindness. The guards, most of them young men drafted from the American South and Midwest, watched this transformation daily. Some had fought overseas, others had never left home. To them, the Germans were both enemies and curiosities, soldiers of a distant cause now laboring under the Texas sun. Yet the respect they extended, even without trust, built an invisible bridge between captor and captive. When Christmas approached, that bridge became visible in small gestures. Prisoners crafted gifts out of wood scraps and twine. Guards passed extra food from the mess hall. A few even exchanged carols through the fence. It was not sentimentality. It was survival of spirit in a time when the world seemed to have none left. And so, by December 1944, in the quiet barracks of Camp Hearn, an unlikely sense of coexistence had taken root. It was in this strange middle ground, between duty and mercy, that one act would soon define the meaning of Christmas behind barbed wire. By late 1944, Germany was collapsing. Allied bombers roared above the Reich day and night. The once proud Wehrmacht was retreating on both fronts, from Normandy in the west, from the Vistula in the east. But in the quiet interior of America, far from the gunfire and ruins, thousands of German soldiers were living a strange kind of exile, safe, fed, and isolated from the war that had consumed their homeland. For many, captivity in America was a second awakening. They arrived believing they were defending civilization from chaos, the product of years of Nazi indoctrination that painted America as a land of racial decay and barbarism. Yet what they found was clean water, organized rations, fair discipline, and even baseball games played on Sunday afternoons. Letters from home told of hunger, bombings, and despair, while life in the camp grew steadily more humane. The dissonance was unbearable for some. Men who had marched in iron discipline under the swastika now found themselves planting tomatoes beside their guards. A few resisted this softening. Others quietly began to question everything they had believed. The American command understood the psychological opportunity. Through the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, the U.S. Army initiated education programs, English classes, newspapers, lectures on democracy, even films that showed the American way of life. While propaganda was forbidden under the Geneva Convention, information exchange was not. The goal was clear: to seed a new Germany before the war had even ended. Inside Camp Hearn and dozens of others, libraries opened with donated books, German and English alike. Red Cross parcels arrived with cigarettes, soap, and letters. For many prisoners, these small privileges blurred the lines between captivity and community. Still, the emotional distance between guard and prisoner remained fragile. Texans were proud, direct men, raised on self-reliance and quiet faith. Many had brothers overseas fighting the same army these men once served. To them, the Germans behind the fence represented both the enemy and a reflection of their own discipline. The relationship was professional, rarely personal, but over time respect grew through repetition. The simple ritual of showing up each morning, sharing coffee, exchanging nods through the wire. That mutual respect did not erase the war. It illuminated its contradictions. Some guards confessed in letters that they felt pity for the men they once wanted dead. Others admitted confusion. How could these well-mannered prisoners come from the same regime that built concentration camps? The Germans, too, were conflicted. The older soldiers clung to pride. The younger ones wrestled with guilt they could not name. The cowboy hats, the easy laughter of the guards, the smell of tobacco and fried cornbread drifting from the mess hall. These things painted an image of America that felt impossibly human, impossibly kind. By Christmas 1944, this emotional tension had reached its quiet peak. The war in Europe was entering its bloodiest winter. In the Ardennes, German forces had just launched the desperate Battle of the Bulge. News traveled fast, even to Texas. The prisoners listened to radio reports with sinking hearts. They knew their homeland was burning. Inside Camp Hearn, the guards decorated the mess hall with paper stars and pine garlands. The prisoners hung makeshift ornaments from wooden beams. For the first time, some guards and captives shared music across the barbed wire. Silent, cautious, but deeply human. Among them was a Texan guard, barely 22, who had grown up breaking horses and baling hay near San Antonio. He'd never seen Europe, never faced combat, but the war had shaped him all the same. On that night, he watched the Germans singing Stille Nacht and felt something stir within him. A recognition that these men, stripped of uniforms and orders, were simply men. The cowboy hat he wore had been his father's. It wasn't much, just sweat-stained felt and a bent brim. But to him it symbolized everything he loved: home, family, decency. And when he saw one prisoner shivering in the cold, staring toward the wire as if lost between two worlds, the guard knew exactly what to do. The moment that would follow, small, wordless and unrecorded in any military log, would outlive the war itself. The human angle. Between enemies and men for the German prisoners, captivity in Texas was both a humiliation and a liberation. They had fought for a cause that demanded absolute loyalty, that crushed individual thought beneath national pride. Yet here, in the heart of the enemy's land, they found something disarming: fairness. Many POWs had expected harsh punishment, starvation, or even execution. Nazi propaganda had portrayed Americans as ruthless savages. Instead, they discovered guards who enforced rules with consistency but not cruelty. This quiet decency unsettled them. It forced reflection on their leaders, their ideology, and their own humanity. The prisoners began to adapt. They built small gardens beside their barracks, crafted toys for local children, and painted murals on the walls. Letters to families in Germany described a strange new world, one where the enemy offered respect. Some wrote that they feared returning home, uncertain how to live again in a land that had demanded hate. That emotional dissonance ran deep. The men realized that war had not ended their humanity. Captivity had revealed it. The night the Texan guard offered his hat, that revelation reached its purest form. A moment when both sides silently admitted the truth, that decency could survive even under barbed wire. The American angle, duty, not hatred for the guards, most of them young and from rural America. The work was monotonous but moral. They were trained to uphold the Geneva Convention, to treat their captives according to the same principles they hoped their own boys would receive overseas. Yet this was not an easy task. Some had lost brothers in Italy or France. Some had written letters to widowed mothers. Their resentment ran deep, but so did their upbringing. Texans, especially those raised on ranches and church pews, were taught that a man's worth came from how he handled power. And now, power rested in their hands. Commanders reminded them constantly, "We are Americans first, not avengers." The purpose of the POW camps was not punishment, but containment and re-education. Every guard who followed that rule became a quiet ambassador for American ideals: liberty, discipline, and humanity under restraint. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the cicadas began to hum, some guards and prisoners spoke through the fence about farming, weather, and families. Not about the war. The language barrier made honesty easier. They learned to respect each other's silence. The young Texan guard at Camp Hearn embodied this ethos. His act of giving away his hat wasn't political or sentimental. It was instinct, an unspoken expression of that code. You never let a man stand cold when you could spare warmth, even if he wore a different uniform. The command angle, the strategy of humanity behind these individual acts, stood policy. The U.S. War Department had calculated early on that humane treatment of German POWs could serve a long-term goal: rebuilding Europe after victory. General George C. Marshall and the Army's provost. Marshall General's office established strict protocols, ensuring POWs received fair rations, pay for labor, and cultural programs. This policy wasn't driven by sympathy. It was driven by foresight. America was already preparing for a world after Hitler, and re-educating captured Germans was part of that design. The government knew that most of these men would return to Germany, and they wanted them to carry with them a memory of fairness, not vengeance. So in classrooms built inside camps, American officers lectured about democracy, law, and individual rights. Films were screened, not propaganda reels, but Hollywood dramas showing ordinary American life: families, farms, schools. The contrast to what these men had been told in Germany was staggering. The policy worked quietly. When repatriation began in 1945-46, many returning POWs became advocates for post-war friendship, spreading stories of dignity they'd never expected to receive. Historians later noted that these camps planted the seeds of reconciliation years before diplomacy began. And in that context, a single gesture, a cowboy hat offered through a fence, was no anomaly. It was a symbol of a larger truth, that America's power, at its best, was not measured by its weapons, but by its restraint. The barbed wire may have separated them physically, but the moral distance between captor and captive was shrinking by the day. That transformation, from enemy to human, would deepen even further when culture and identity entered the story. The cultural angle, America's myth meets. Europe's collapse to a German soldier raised in the militarized rigidity of the Third Reich. The American South was a revelation. The landscape itself felt like a contradiction. Vast skies, open land, people who moved and spoke with a freedom they had never known. Texas in particular represented something almost mythic, and the cowboy. In Europe, the cowboy was an icon of chaos and rebellion, often vilified by Nazi propaganda as the symbol of lawlessness and racial impurity. But to those held behind the fences of Camp Hearn, that image began to change. The cowboy wasn't a bandit. He was an individual, proud, fearless, loyal to his code, yet beholden to no dictator. When the Texan guard handed over his hat, that moment transcended mere kindness. It was an unintentional cultural exchange, America's self-image meeting Germany's broken one. The hat, shaped by sun and labor, carried the scent of dust, leather, and independence. It represented a life lived by one's own principles, not by orders shouted from podiums. To the German prisoner who received it, the gesture may have felt like a window into another kind of world, one where dignity didn't depend on rank or race, but on how a man treated others. Long after he returned home, that memory would outlast the slogans, the speeches, and the ruins. The psychological angle, the disarming power of mercy acts of mercy during wartime often unsettle those who receive them. For soldiers shaped by years of totalitarian conditioning, compassion from an enemy was not only unexpected, it was destabilizing. In the minds of many German POWs, the American camps became a space where their identity fractured. They were still soldiers, still proud, but stripped of command and ideology. The kindness of their guards forced them into introspection, something their wartime existence had never allowed. Psychologists studying post-war testimonies later found that such encounters played a profound role in moral recovery. Some POWs described it as spiritual shock, the moment they realized that the enemy was not a monster and therefore neither were they. For others, it was guilt that their nation had inflicted horrors while being treated with decency abroad. The Texan guard's gesture condensed that entire psychological transformation into a single act. A symbol of mercy so disarming it could pierce through years of indoctrination. The prisoner's tears that night were not simply gratitude, and they were grief, confusion, and release. In that brief moment, mercy became a mirror in which both men saw their own humanity reflected back at them. The symbolic angle, the hat and the wire, every war has its symbols, flags, medals, ruins. But in this small corner of Texas, the symbol was a hat and a fence. The fence represented division, two nations, two beliefs, two ways of seeing the world. The hat represented everything that crossed it: empathy, courage, and individual conscience. When one passed through the other, the meaning of the war itself shifted. To historians, this scene might appear trivial, a minor anecdote lost among grander battles. Yet in symbolism, scale is irrelevant. History often hides its deepest truths in the smallest gestures. That cowboy hat was not just a gift. It was defiance against the dehumanization that defined the era. The prisoner's tears, the guard's quiet nod, the stillness that followed, all of it became an unspoken ceremony. A ritual of reconciliation long before peace was declared. Later, when prisoners were released, many carried souvenirs home: carved figurines, drawings, or pieces of barbed wire. But some carried only memories. In one account, a returning POW described a guard who looked like freedom itself. Whether or not he meant the same man, his words captured the heart of that night. That freedom, at its purest, could exist even inside a cage. The cultural bridge had been built, not through treaties or speeches, but through one man's instinctive kindness. And soon, as the war's tide finally turned toward its end, that quiet act would find its echo in the camp's final days, when the world outside began to collapse, and the human connections inside the wire became their only anchor. Camp Hearn, Texas, December 24, 1944. The night fell cold and clear. Frost settled on the razor wire, sparkling faintly under the guard tower's lamps. The sound of boots on gravel echoed between the barracks, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. Inside the wire, the German prisoners had decorated a small fir tree they'd been allowed to cut from nearby woods. It stood in the corner of their barracks, trimmed with scraps of foil, paper, and carved wood. A hand-painted sign above it read, "Frieden auf Erden, peace on earth." For many of them, this was the third Christmas spent away from home. Letters from Germany came sporadically, their ink smudged by time and distance. Some men knew their cities no longer existed. Cologne, Hamburg, Kassel, names that once meant home now belonged to ruins. Still they sang, not for Germany, not for victory, but for memory. As darkness deepened, the soft hum of Stille Nacht began to drift from the barracks. Dozens of voices, low and reverent, rose into the cold night. From the tower, the Texan guard paused his patrol. He knew the melody instantly. His mother had sung it in church every Christmas since he was a child. He set down his rifle, leaning it against the post, and listened. For a moment, the barbed wire ceased to exist. The war in Europe felt like a dream from another lifetime. The men behind that fence could have been his brothers, his cousins, his neighbors. When the song ended, silence stretched across the camp. Not uneasy, but sacred. A silence that felt like understanding. Then, as if guided by something older than orders, the guard reached up and lifted the Stetson from his head. The hat was worn and sweat-stained, the brim warped by Texas sun and years of use. He turned it in his hands for a long time, tracing the frayed edge with his thumb. At the far end of the fence, a German prisoner, young, gaunt, his uniform patched and faded, was staring toward him. Their eyes met briefly, no words, just a stillness that held the weight of everything that had come before. The guard walked closer, boots crunching softly on the frost. He stopped at the fence and held up the hat, uncertain, almost shy. The prisoner hesitated. Behind him, the other Germans watched, silent as stone. Slowly, cautiously, the prisoner approached. The barbed wire glinted between them, a reminder of the world that had drawn them apart. And yet, in that instant, both seemed to forget it was there. The guard extended his arm, pressing the brim of the hat gently through an opening in the wire. The prisoner reached out, his hand trembling, and took it. He held it as though it were something sacred. His lips moved, whispering "Danke," though the guard could barely hear it. Then the prisoner placed the hat over his cropped hair and stood motionless as if afraid to breathe. No laughter. No applause. Just silence, deep, unbroken, and holy. The guard nodded once. The prisoner returned it, his eyes shining with tears he refused to hide. Behind him, someone began softly to hum the carol again. One by one, the others joined in. The guard turned away, pulling his coat tighter. He didn't speak to anyone about it. He didn't have to. Some moments didn't need witnesses to endure. In that still night, in a camp surrounded by wire and war, the meaning of Christmas had returned to both of them, stripped of flags, politics, or victory. Only the truth remained, that mercy can exist even when everything else is lost. But that small exchange did not end there. Word of it spread quietly through the camp, whispered between prisoners, noticed by fellow guards. It became a story that carried far beyond that fence, finding its way into letters, memories, and eventually, the history of reconciliation itself. The following morning, Christmas Day 1944, dawn broke over Camp Hearn in a pale golden haze. The frost glimmered like glass on the wire, and a faint mist rolled across the empty fields beyond. The war felt far away, but only for a moment. Inside the barracks, the German prisoners stirred awake to the sound of footsteps and the distant hum of the camp kitchen. A few still whispered about the night before. Word had spread. A Texan guard had given his hat to a prisoner. Nobody knew his name, and no one dared ask. In the strange code of men at war, some gestures were too sacred to be dissected. The recipient of the hat, a former corporal from the 15th Panzer Division, sat quietly by his bunk, running his fingers along the brim. He hadn't slept. All night he had replayed the moment in his mind. The guard's steady eyes, the silence, the way the cold wind had seemed to disappear. For the first time since his capture, he didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt human again. Others noticed. They teased him softly, calling him Cowboy, but there was affection in their tone. Even the stricter ones, the older sergeants who still clung to pride and discipline, couldn't mock the gesture. Something about it had pierced through the walls they had built inside themselves. That day, the guards distributed extra rations, coffee, fruit, a little sugar. The Red Cross had sent parcels marked for Christmas. Men smiled, nodded, exchanged greetings across the fence. The tension that normally hung over the camp like static seemed to dissolve, if only briefly. By afternoon, some prisoners began carving small wooden stars as gifts for the guards. Others painted postcards, sketches of the camp, the fields, the distant horizon. The cowboy hat appeared in several drawings, always on the head of a faceless man, standing between two worlds. For the Americans, the story spread as quietly as it had begun. A few guards chuckled when they heard, "That sounds like something one of ours would do." Others felt a sting of pride. They understood it instinctively. In that single gesture, the war had been reduced to what it always truly was: one man holding power, and another man trusting him not to abuse it. That night, a report from Europe reached the camp. German forces had launched their desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands were dying in snow-covered forests, and both sides were fighting with a ferocity unseen since the Somme. Yet here, halfway across the world, two enemies had found peace in a single act. As the weeks passed, the story of the cowboy hat turned into something of a legend within Camp Hearn. Nobody wrote it down, but everyone remembered it. For the prisoners, it became a symbol of what they hoped still existed in the world: decency. For the guards, it was proof that America's strength was not only in its armies, but in its restraint. When spring arrived in 1945, the camp began to change. News of Germany's collapse trickled in. First rumors, then confirmations. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. Men who had once stood proudly at attention now sat quietly in disbelief. Some wept. Some refused to believe it. The prisoner who wore the cowboy hat didn't join the debates. He spent his mornings working in the fields, the brim shading his face from the Texas sun. The guards watched him, recognizing him instantly by the hat that had become almost a uniform of its own. He began helping with translation duties, speaking both German and passable English. The camp command trusted him. The other prisoners respected him. To the Texan guard, he became a reminder that kindness once given doesn't vanish. It multiplies. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the atmosphere at Camp Hearn shifted. Some prisoners cheered. Others stood in silence, unsure of who they were without the war. Repatriation orders soon followed. On the morning of departure, the German prisoners gathered by the gate, each man carrying a small bag and 1,000 memories. The guard, now bareheaded under the Texas sun, stood by the truck line as they boarded. The former corporal, the man who wore the hat, approached slowly. He took it from his head, now more worn than ever, and held it out to return. The guard shook his head. "Keep it," he said quietly. The prisoner hesitated, then saluted, not as soldier to enemy, but as one man to another. His voice broke slightly when he spoke. "I will." He climbed into the truck, the brim low over his eyes. As the convoy rumbled away down the dusty road, the guard raised his hand in farewell. Neither looked back. In the silence that followed, the wind carried the faintest trace of a familiar tune, Stille Nacht, sung softly by the departing men. It drifted over the wire, mingled with the dust, and was gone. The war outside was ending. But the memory of that night, of a single act of compassion stronger than any uniform or flag, would not fade. And in the quiet corners of post-war life, it would resurface again, in letters and reunions, in the shared stories of men who once faced each other across the wire. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. In Texas, the news arrived like a distant echo, a wave that broke not with noise but with silence. The loudspeakers at Camp Hearn crackled to life that morning. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. For a long moment, no one spoke. The guards stood at attention. The prisoners froze mid-task. It was as if the world itself had stopped to exhale. Then, one by one, the Germans removed their caps. Some bowed their heads. Others simply stared into the distance, unable to grasp what surrender truly meant. The cowboy hat, now frayed and sweat-stained from months under the Texas sun, hung from a hook near the barracks door. Its owner, the former German corporal, looked at it for a long time before placing it gently into his duffel bag. He knew the moment had come. Soon they would all be gone. The slow homecoming repatriation was not immediate. For months the camp remained a liminal world, neither wartime nor peace. The men tended gardens, repaired tools, even helped nearby farmers rebuild barns and fences damaged by storms. Texas had adopted them in a way, and many locals had grown used to seeing them on trucks, laughing and waving as they passed. The American guards treated them not as enemies now, but as fellow laborers. The war had stripped away ideology. What remained were calloused hands, sunburnt faces, and the shared exhaustion of men who had seen too much. Letters began to arrive from Europe. Some bore terrible news. Families lost in bombings, cities in ruins. Others brought hope, wives and children waiting, homes somehow still standing. The prisoners passed the letters around quietly, the air heavy with both grief and gratitude. In one of those letters, the corporal's younger brother wrote from a shattered village near Cologne. He described hunger, rubble, and the strange feeling of seeing American soldiers handing out food instead of bullets. The corporal folded the paper carefully and said nothing for a long time. Maybe, he finally whispered to another prisoner, the world has learned something. The photograph before the first transport left. The camp commander allowed a final group photograph, Americans and Germans standing side by side in front of the barracks. The corporal stood in the second row, still wearing the cowboy hat. The Texan guard who had given it to him stood beside him. Expression unreadable but eyes kind. The photograph, captured on a standard U.S. Army Signal Corps camera, would later end up in both men's possession, mailed decades apart, reprinted in family albums on opposite sides of the Atlantic. In that photo, nothing hinted at who had won or lost. There were no ranks, no pride, no bitterness, just men, tired and alive, standing in the Texas sun, the journey home. When the trucks finally came, the prisoners climbed aboard in silence. Some wept openly, others smiled, promising to write letters they knew they never would. The Texan guard helped load their few belongings, a duffel, a photograph, a handful of carved trinkets. When the corporal's turn came, he hesitated at the bottom step. The guard extended his hand. For a brief second, time folded. The war, the songs, the fence, the night of the hat, all blending into one quiet understanding. They shook hands firmly, then let go. The convoy rumbled down the dirt road, dust swirling like fog. The Americans stood watching until the last truck disappeared beyond the horizon. Then slowly, the camp returned to stillness. In the evenings that followed, the guard often found himself staring across the empty field, where voices once echoed and songs drifted through the night. The silence now felt heavier. The war had ended, but its imprint remained, not in gunfire but in memory. Across the ocean months later, the German corporal stepped off a ship in Bremerhaven. Germany was a landscape of ruin. Cities bombed to skeletons, bridges collapsed, streets lined with the wreckage of an empire that had devoured itself. He carried nothing but his duffel and the hat. People stared, an American Stetson in the heart of broken Germany. Some mocked, some admired. To him, it wasn't a symbol of victory or shame. It was a reminder that humanity could survive even in the ashes. He walked for days to reach his village near the Rhine. His family's house was gone, reduced to rubble. But his younger brother was alive, thin, pale, but alive. When they embraced, the hat slipped from his shoulder and fell into the dirt. His brother picked it up, brushing it clean. "From Texas?" he asked. The corporal smiled faintly. "From a man who forgot I was his enemy." They said nothing more. The war was over, but the weight of what had been done, and what had been forgiven, would take a lifetime to understand. Time moved on. The war faded into books, memorials, and black and white photographs, yet for those who lived it, the memories never dulled. They only softened. The Texan guard after returning home from Camp Hearn. The guard, whose name was Corporal James Rowe, married his childhood sweetheart and went back to ranching outside of Waco. He rarely spoke of the war. When his children asked what it was like, he would simply say, "Loud, long, and lonely." But each Christmas Eve, he would take out a small box from a dresser drawer. Inside was a folded copy of the camp photograph, creased and yellowed. His thumb always stopped on one face, him, the German wearing the Stetson. He never told the story in full. All he would say was, "That man reminded me the world doesn't end just because men start shooting." When he passed away in 1978, the photo was found tucked inside his Bible, next to a note in his own handwriting. "We met as enemies. We parted as men." The German prisoner across the ocean, the former prisoner, Heinrich Krüger, rebuilt his life in the small town of Bonn. He found work as a carpenter, later starting a small furniture shop with his brother. On the wall above his workbench hung a single framed item, the cowboy hat still dusty, its leather cracked with age. Customers often asked where he'd gotten it. Heinrich would smile softly and answer, "It was a Christmas gift, from a good man, For decades, he kept that photograph too. In his final years, he often took it down, tracing the faces one by one. When his granddaughter once asked, "Opa, were you friends with those Americans?" He nodded. "Not at first," he said, "but one night we remembered we were both human." He died in 1982. His children placed the hat on the coffin during the funeral, a quiet tribute to the moment that had given their father back his faith in people. The rediscovery 40 years later in 1994, an exhibit opened at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. It was dedicated to the experience of German POWs held in America. Among the items donated anonymously was an old black and white photograph of men standing side by side, Americans and Germans together. Visitors paused often at that image. Something in it transcended explanation. The weary smiles, the sunlight, the Stetson on the German's head. A few months later, a letter arrived from Bonn. It was written by Heinrich's daughter, who had seen a newspaper mention of the exhibit. Enclosed was a photograph of the same scene, and a note that read, "My father always said a man in Texas gave him back his Christmas. I think this is him." Museum archivists compared the images. They matched perfectly. Two prints of the same moment preserved on opposite sides of the Atlantic for half a century. The discovery made local news. Families of both men eventually connected through correspondence, exchanging stories, sharing memories, even visiting one another years later. At a small gathering in Waco, Texas, the German family presented the original hat, now carefully restored, to the museum. It was placed on display under soft light, beside the twin photographs and a simple caption, "Camp Hearn, Texas, 1944. When enemies remembered they were men." Legacy for visitors, it became one of the most quietly moving exhibits, not because it told of victory or defeat, but because it reminded them of something older than war itself: mercy. Teachers brought students there each Christmas season, and veterans would often stand before the case for long minutes without speaking. Some saluted, others simply wiped their eyes. In a century defined by destruction, one small act of kindness between a Texan guard and a German prisoner had survived longer than all the battles that tried to divide them. The story of the hat had come full circle, from frost-covered wire to museum glass. Proof that humanity, when given even a flicker of light, will always find a way to endure. War often reduces men to symbols, uniforms, ranks, enemies. It strips away faces, turning individuals into statistics on paper or shadows in the smoke. But every so often, a single moment breaks through that darkness. Something small, fragile, and unmistakably human. The story of the cowboy hat at Camp Hearn was one of those moments. It didn't change the outcome of the war, nor alter any map of Europe. Yet in its simplicity, it revealed what no victory speech or peace treaty could: that mercy is not a weakness of war, but its quietest triumph. Both men, James Rowe and Heinrich Kruger, lived their remaining years far from the fences that once divided them. They never met again, yet the space between them was filled by something deeper than friendship: understanding. The kind of understanding that outlives nations and ideologies, that whispers across generations when flags have long been folded away. In the cold light of history, we remember wars for their generals, their machines, their destruction. But history's truest weight often rests not in the clash of armies, but in the silence after, in the eyes of two men who, for one moment, remembered that compassion doesn't belong to victors or vanquished. That night in Texas, under a sky full of frost and stars, a guard offered a hat to a prisoner. One hand reached out through the wire, another reached back. Between them hung the entire tragedy and the entire hope of the 20th century. And when the song of Stille Nacht drifted once more into the dark, it carried with it not just the memory of war, but the echo of forgiveness, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, the smallest act of grace can still light the way home.